Good morning. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to review Chapter 1 on the textbook. It's a pretty interesting overview of federalism, its definitions. Tends to be a tad bit complex and somewhat dry upon first read, so my purpose in holding these video supplementals is to try and go back not over the textbook, but to try and provide a slightly different perspective, or at least a perspective that enables you to better grasp much of the material that's presented. So I'll continue to do that throughout the semester. Hopefully these videos will stay between 15 and 20 minutes, and they are to be used as a supplement, although the material that I give you will also be subject to the exam. I want to talk just on three perspectives. It was a 25-page chapter, and the authors, Stevens and Wickstrom, went through very carefully the major points in describing the federal system in one chapter. Oftentimes there are whole books written on just the parts that they discussed. And I think he did a pretty good job in describing the various elements of the federal system. My only criticism is that they both are quite opinionated in their understanding and their positions on several matters, and it comes across in their writings. They refer to, for example, the open quote, so-called war on terror, which I think is an inappropriate editorial comment in a textbook. And they also refer to the U.S. contemporarily as a plutocracy, which may or may not be true. It sort of takes away from the definition of the purpose of the chapter by describing federalism, I think. And I'll try to give you a slightly different perspective. Much of what they say is true. I have no problem with the factual content, but clearly their opinions are evident in the course of presenting their material. I'm not going to quarrel with their opinions. I'm just going to try and make sure that we keep a perspective going through the entire class so you can form your own opinions. I'm going to talk just about three things this morning. With respect to this first video, basically just my comments on the overview of federalism. I want to focus on the concept of sovereignty, which I believe is crucial to the understanding of federalism in the American system. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit this week and next week about what we refer to as a republican form of government, because it was a type of government that was invented by the founders in the 18th century that truly gave life to the concept of democracy. And I'll try and hit just the highlights of those points pretty quickly. First of all, I do appreciate the definition of Stevens and Wickstrom that federalism itself can be defined as an interaction or the interrelationships from the multiple levels of government. There are several examples around the world of countries that have subdivided the government among provinces or states or areas, and that generally is done to assist in the administration of government where it happens. Oftentimes there's a fairly strong national government or a fairly weak national government, and the resulting federal system kind of fills in the gaps. The U.S. is considered actually neither of those. Morton Grosdon, a famous author, and you don't have to know anything except understand the concept here, wrote in the 1960s that it doesn't work to understand federalism as a level, a hierarchical level of power between a national government and state governments and local governments. Contrasting a unitary government like Britain, where there is a national government in London that has authority over the entire country, federal government is one in which authority is divided. And the nature of that division and the purpose of that division is a key to understanding how then intergovernmental relations in that country work. Grosdon says the complexity of the American system is that it's not hierarchical, where power is clearly defined at the federal government, and certain power devolves to the state, and certain power devolves to the locals, although it may seem that way. In reality, he calls it a marble cake, in which almost every action of governmental life involves some level of state and local and federal activity. From the police action that has the FBI working with the state police and the local cops, to grants, to earthquake relief, to emergency management, to education programs, I go on and on and on. There's almost no actions of government in which you do not see all three powers intermingling all the time. The authors cite Albert McMahon, and I have on the slide here just a notion of his definition of what characterizes a federal government. And it has stood the test of time in terms of defining what we mean when we say federalism, especially in the United States. First of all, it means that power is divided. This is an important concept. Power is not delegated. The power is not delegated from the federal government to the cities. Power is divided. There is an independent power in the federal government. But there's also independent power in the city government. As I told you last week, a president cannot fire a mayor. A governor cannot fire a mayor. Any entity that is elected by the people in this country is an independent entity, and there is an independent power source. That's criteria number one. Criteria number two is that each level of government, a city, a county, a state, has independent authority over its people. The people are citizens of the United States, but they're also citizens of a state, and they reside in a city. And while they're in those jurisdictions, the authority in those jurisdictions has power over the people, has authority to enforce the laws and to regulate behavior and to impose sanctions. That's another piece, because on a routine basis, if the state has authority or a city has authority over a certain matter, you'll see the federal government deferring or backing off, unless it can identify a bigger or a larger authority that in its view would trump the state authority. But simply because it is the federal government, it cannot get involved. Simply because it's the state government, it cannot get involved in local or city matters. Number three is that implicit in this, and it relates to number two, is that there is direct authority, command authority. Once a local policeman arrests you, that arrest cannot be undone unless someone finds a violation of law or procedures. Fourth, there is a tremendous amount of discretion about how the city, state, local governments can work. There are 50 states, and there's all kinds of counties and cities. And aside from the fact that they must all be run on a democratic principle, meaning that people must have a voice in the government, there must be elections, the state can form any type of government. It can be a parliamentary system, it can be a system like the national government, it can be some new system, it can experiment. Nebraska has wiped out its Senate because of disagreement of some of the Supreme Court rules. It has only one house. Other houses have two, other states have two houses, and each state and each city has the ability to organize itself the way it believes is necessary. And fifth, and most important, according to McMahon, is that the various units of government have independent authority. And that's an important constituent point, meaning they must be seen as equal above the law. A big state like New York does not have more legal power than a South Carolina or a Florida or a Montana. The authors also refer in chapter 1, and I'd like you to understand this a little bit, to Daniel Elazar, who was a political science writing in the 1960s, about 10 years after Grodzin. He was a student of Grodzin's, and he tried to elaborate on this. So Elazar comes back and says that there are 4 principles, in addition to McMahon's 5 characteristics, that need to be understood. First of all, in a federal system, in the American federal system, there is national supremacy. And systems that do not have national supremacy are usually called confederate systems. A federal system means that there's national supremacy. During the Civil War, when the South seceded, it was the Confederate States of America. It had a nominal capital in Richmond, but the states were far more independent, and far more able to determine their own destiny and their own extent to which they would follow laws and regulations than they have been in the United States or in other federal systems. Number 2 is that there is substantial authority to spend money, to legislate and to spend money, meaning each state to a large extent cannot be just dependent on the federal largesse. To be a viable entity, it must be able to raise revenue to conduct its programs. Number 3 for Elazar is that there, in the American context especially, there are reinforcing processes that strengthen the role of states. One of our biggest ones is the election. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about the Electoral College in the next video. But if you want to understand why we tolerate a system in which the loser can win, one of the reasons is the whole purpose of the Electoral College is to enhance and validate the critical role of the states in understanding American democracy. And Elazar points out many other areas in which the processes of government reinforce the separation and the division of powers. And then finally, and in recent years, the states have become essential in administering federal programs. Federal programs will put out money, large amounts of money in grants, in block grants, and the states must be organized to receive that money and to administer it in a way that's consistent with the federal purpose. So look, by way of definition, those are probably the most important things to understand from the first chapter as we get to understand what is federalism and why it's different than a unitary government. With those elements of describing what federalism is, you can hopefully begin to understand the values that have emerged that cause people to be loyal to states, cause states to have cultures, have states to have histories, have communities within states to feel independent. Because Elazar writes about the ebb and flow of power through various times in our history, and that certainly has been the case in recent history, where a strong central government coming out of the 1960s and 70s with the Great Society was met by the Ronald Reagan Revolution and a concept called New Federalism, in which he pushed power back to the states with grants of money to the states for discretionary activity. After the recession of 2008 and other events, you see more power coming to the federal government again. You see political campaigns, as we have currently, in which many candidates, especially on the Republican side, are wanting less power in the federal government and more power in the states. So it's the back and forth ebb of flow of power that best characterizes American federalism. It's not a static situation, it's evolutionary. And it will continue to evolve, I think, in our lifetime. The concept of sovereignty is critical to the understanding of both American democracy and federalism. Many students have a hard time with the notion of sovereignty. I start almost every class by asking what that is. And I'd ask you to think about it right now. What do you think sovereignty is? All you have to do is go back and think of how they used to refer to the kings and emperors as the sovereign, and many still do. And then you realize that in the days of the kings and the emperors, the sovereign was the highest authority. The highest authority in the land. Every country has a sovereign. Every country is sovereign, meaning it is supreme with respect to its subjects, and within the country there is a legal entity that is known as the sovereign. In Britain, the sovereign power is the Parliament. Parliament can enact almost any law, and there is virtually no vehicle to challenge it because there is no written constitution in Britain. Other countries, Hitler was the sovereign in Germany, the Soviet Party was the sovereign in the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro was the sovereign in Cuba. In the United States, sovereignty is different. And we can talk about entities of government having fundamental roles. The Congress can pass legislation. Many think it should be sovereign. The President, of course, commander of the armed forces, people think it should be sovereign. The Supreme Court has the final say on legislation and conflicts. It should be sovereign. But in reality, each, as you know from your undergraduate classes, has a check on the other. The only place where there is no check is in the first three words of the Constitution, the preamble, which starts off, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, and we do ordain this Constitution of the United States of America." In the United States, the people create the Constitution. The Constitution creates the government, and that is the most significant statement of the power relations in this democracy. And it goes a long way to defining the reason that we have a federal government and the reason that we have the independent role of a lot of states. The Constitution also has three different provisions that reinforce this notion of sovereignty. Number one, in Article 5 of the Constitution, the amendment power. No other country I know gives the people the power to amend its basic document. We've amended the Constitution since the Bill of Rights only 18 times, and they've been started by a congressional action in which 3/4 of the states have to agree, and when that happens, the Constitution is amended. That process was copied after the initial process of ratification. When the framers got together in Philadelphia and put together the Constitution, and they circulated it back among the 13 colonies, the rule was, as soon as 3/4 of the states agree, bingo, the Constitution becomes the law of the land, and it becomes a new nation. And as soon as Rhode Island agreed to the Constitution, the United States was born. They put in the provision that that process can play itself out over and over again. If we got together as a class and put together a list of things we wanted to see changed, move the capital to Kansas, eliminate the presidency, create 5 days in which no one had to pay taxes, anything like that, if that resolution was picked up by the state legislatures from Sacramento to Albany to Houston to any place. And in those state legislatures, the legislators voted to adopt that as a constitutional amendment. When 3/4 of the states, or 35 states, agreed to that, the Constitution is instantly changed by acts of the people. There's no government I know of in this world in which the people can change the government without the government being involved. And that's a critical notion of where power actually resides. It hasn't been exercised, it's out there latent, but it serves as a reminder of the power of the people. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution talks about all power not specifically identified in the Constitution remains the province of the states and the people. And the First Amendment, to try and show the limits of our government, has the first three words of the First Amendment, the critical amendment on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It says, Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, etc. There is no government I'm aware of in which the basic document says government cannot do something. And yet the adherence to the rights of the people in our Constitution has limited powers to those things which are expressly enumerated or those which can be inferred. And when the Constitution says Congress shall make no law, it suggests there's a power higher than the Congress that will prevent that from happening. So as we begin our understanding of federalism, it is very important to realize that it is a system that was developed to ensure that the people remain sovereign, to ensure that a government does not grow to the extent that it can just obviate the will of the people. We have come close to that. When our practices become arbitrary and unaccountable, we have political reform, and our history has been one of constant reform. But that reform is only made possible because of the commitment in our government to maintaining the sovereignty of the people as the ultimate decision maker. And ultimately where that gets us is to the notion of the government that we created, which was called by James Madison a Republican form of government. Look, the founders were faced with a very difficult position in the late 1780s when they got together to try and repair the problems of the Articles of Confederation. They met in Annapolis in the summer of 1785 to fix the really struggling Articles of Confederation. The country was in crisis. There was very little hope that it was going to continue. People were actually yearning for the days of British rule. After 4 or 5 days in Annapolis, Maryland, which is my hometown, they realized that the problems were too significant, and they put out a call to come to Philadelphia the following summer and repair the country by addressing the exigencies of the nation. They won the revolution based on the principles of freedom and the rights of the individual, but now they had to create a government that was going to be effective, that's going to work. They were faced with a couple of problems. Number one, there were no functioning democracies. So when we talk about things like elections, they never had any. There's no model. They said, well, we need a president. What is that? They didn't know. There's George Washington. They said, you be president, and whatever you do is what the president is. And frankly, the development of the presidency largely began by watching and copying the precedents set by Washington and causing those things to be the power of the presidency. There was no such thing as a Supreme Court. All that was brand new, and so they struggled with trying to understand what this stuff was. The biggest question was, what is a democracy? Because they had been aware that where democracies had worked and functioned in the previous history, from Athens to a little bit of Rome to the Paris Commune experiment in the 1870s, they had only happened where there were small, homogeneous populations, where people who were similar in background, in culture, similar religions, similar trades, could get together and agree essentially on the rules of the game and essentially abide by something called majority rule. But that wasn't going to work. They saw in the Articles of Confederation, where you had the industrialists of the North, you had the statesmen of Philadelphia, you had the Southern farmers and the Southern way of life all being a dramatic difference in lifestyle, and there was almost no way to compromise differences among those 13 colonies, much less the differences that were bound to occur when the nation began to grow, as everyone knew it would. There was clear focus by the time of the Constitution on the Western territories as the next new colonies or states. So what the founders were able to do, largely through the works of James Madison, and I'll be continuing this lecture next week with some readings of Madison that I'd like you to have, to understand he was the brainchild for much of what has happened in the United States and much of the understanding of federalism. He suggested that the problem they were facing with is that they were only aware of three kinds of governments. There was a monarchy, in which the king was basically supreme. There was a despotism in which a strong man, or Genghis Khan, or a local dictator had taken control and also ruled with absolute power. And there was a notion of democracies that had been practiced in Paris and Athens, and that seemed to be consistent with the writings of the modern-day enlightened people in the Enlightenment movement of the 16th, 17th century, of John Locke and Montesquieu and the framers of democracy. But no one had ever seen it happen before, and there was a huge skepticism where it could work, where there were so many inherent differences. And that's when Madison said the key to democracy is that the category of government should not be democracy. The category should be something called popular sovereignty, where the people are in charge. That's the third type, not democracy. So monarchies, despotisms, and popular sovereignty was the third form of government as described by our founders. And that third form of government had two types. One was a democracy, a direct democracy where everything was a vote, everyone had one vote, it was majority rule. The second one was something they began calling a republican form of government, in which the purpose of a republican form of government was to ensure that the people are in charge, but to allow the administration of government to evolve so it was going to produce a more practical and efficient government. And it did that by limiting and prescribing the powers of government, ensuring that government did not have ultimate authority, that it maintained the people, that there was a legislative branch, an executive branch, a judicial branch, but also that there was a vertical separation of power. And this was the most important part, because there was no way, they believed, you're going to get consensus on anything at a national level with 13 different states. And you can look today and look at our problems balancing a budget, or having a cyber strategy, or dealing with immigration, and you have some sympathy with what the founders saw. If we had to have an immigration policy for the Southwest, we could probably do it, or for the Southeast, or for the northern border. But to have an immigration policy that fits the whole country has been very difficult to accomplish. Madison and the framers recognized that, and so they said that the country has to evolve in a way that's considered partly national and partly federal, where those things for which there truly can be a national consensus and a national need, such as foreign policy, military, building of roads, regulation of commerce, those should be the province of the national government, because you're not likely to get a lot of strong opposition. You want efficiency and you want things done because you want to keep the country strong and effective. But as you get down to smaller issues and more focused issues, the differences are varied. What kind of education are we going to have? What kind of law enforcement are we going to have? What's our foreign policy going to be like? How are we going to deal with needs of immigrants in one area or another? Those, said Madison, should not be the role of the federal government, but we should have independent power centers that can deal progressively with the issues that are pertinent to them. And so the states then began to realize as an independent power center that was going to be able to have unlimited and near total authority dealing with those things that are of local concern, understanding that people in the state probably share an awful lot of values and ideas, and you're more likely to come to a democratic consensus by dealing at a state level than you are at a national level. And going further down, when you're dealing with local governments, you're much more likely to have a democratic consensus, a vote, a town hall meeting on issues pertaining to local issues, and therefore the people can really be in charge of their local government dealing with local issues. The people can be in charge of a state government dealing with issues pertinent to a state, and the people can also be in charge of a federal government when the focus is national issues. And it was this process of allocating the three levels of government in a democratic way that was intended on giving the people the maximum discretionary power to act in their own behalf, to set up governments on their own behalf, and to basically run their life and legitimize the country. The authors do a fairly good job in the textbook explaining how the evolution of that has taken place over the past 250 years, noting that in the early days, most government activities were local governments. And increasingly, because there has been an increasing consensus on what's needed at the federal level, the people have permitted and allowed the federal government to assume more and more authority. That works until the people are not happy about that anymore. And the history of our reform has been that once power is accumulated, the people, through their representatives, through elections, begin pulling it back. And the history of American reform has been, frankly, around federalism, more power or less power to the states. We're going to deal more with this topic next week. I'm running out of my time, and I promise you short videos. We're going to deal with this by looking at some of the work of Madison, looking at some of the issues that characterize the evolution of power, and going into a description of contemporary federalism. Thank you.